Today, I'm going to show you how to use Adobe Camera Raw in Photoshop. Hey guys, and welcome to Phlearn. My name is Aaron Nace, and you can find me on Phlearn.com, where we make learning Photoshop and photography fun. Now, today's episode, we're gonna be doing raw processing. We're gonna be using Adobe Camera Raw in Photoshop. So what is a raw image? Well, whenever you take an image with your camera, you have an option to store it as a JPEG, which is an 8-bit image, or a RAW file, which is a 16-bit image. Now, if you guys are photographers and you're serious about your images, I would always recommend to photograph in RAW format because it's gonna give you a lot more information than a JPEG. A JPEG is 8-bit and a RAW is 16-bit. It's a ton more information. What that means is that in Photoshop, in Lightroom, when you go to edit your information, you can bring down, let's say you have highlights that you think are like way overexposed. There's actually information there, and you'll be able to bring some of that information back with a raw processor. If you photograph those as a JPEG, you won't have as much, basically you won't have the capability to fix some of those exposure mistakes and color mistakes and things like that in post-production software. So shoot in RAW, it's gonna give you a lot more options when you're editing your images in things like Lightroom and Photoshop. Now, when you're shooting in RAW, which is 16-bit, you need special software to work with those raw images. So if you're using Lightroom or Aperture or things like that, those are raw processors. Now, Photoshop has one built in, and it's called Adobe Camera Raw, or ACR. Now, this is a program within Photoshop that is specific for processing raw images. Lightroom actually uses the exact same program. So it's like a mini program. Lightroom uses it and Photoshop uses it. So if you have been using Lightroom to process your raw images, totally cool. If you want to use Photoshop to do it, you can definitely bring your raw images into Photoshop. So in today's episode, we're going to be bringing a raw file into Photoshop. I'm going to show you around Adobe Camera Raw, which you're going to find a lot of things are similar to Lightroom. We're going to open up a couple different versions, and I'm going to show you how you can get the most out of your raw images in Photoshop. Let's go ahead and jump into Photoshop. So I'm gonna go to File and down to Open. And now we wanna click on a raw file. We're using a DNG, which stands for digital negative. This is Adobe's version of a raw file. You can also use a CR2 or an NEF. Any raw file will work here. So let's hit Open there. All right, and here we have our Camera Raw. Now, we're gonna go through some of the basic settings today and kind of give an idea of what Camera Raw is actually good for and what I use it for as a photographer. So Camera Raw is designed to edit 16-bit images. Now, the biggest advantages that 16-bit have over 8-bit are things like exposure and your white balance. So if your exposure wasn't right on or your white balance, those are really easy things you can change in 16-bit that are actually pretty difficult to change in 8-bit. So let's go over that. All right, we're gonna look at our white balance to start off with. Now, we have a couple of presets here. We can say like, okay, was it a daylight? That looks pretty good there. Was it cloudy? You can see that's a little bit on the warm side. It was definitely not fluorescent. That's gonna look pretty messed up. So let's go to daylight. You can go to auto as well or as shot. All right. Now, if you are using a gray card, you can always use this tool right up here, which is your white balance tool. If I clicked on my image right now, there's no like pure gray, so it wouldn't work. But if you do use a gray card, that's the perfect tool for you. All right, so we're gonna stick with white balance as daylight here. Now I have a chance to adjust our exposure. I can bring this down or up, and you can see, because we're working in RAW, I have a ton of information here in my shadows and in my highlights. Now, as shot, the sky looks really blown out, like it's pretty much white. But if I bring my exposure down, you can see we actually have a ton of information there in the sky. So we're gonna be working in a little bit to get some of that information back. This is the advantage of shooting in RAW, is that you actually do have a lot of information that may look hidden. You can actually pull this information out of your image. All right, you have adjustments for contrast, highlights, shadows. You can bring your highlights brighter or darker. There we go. Let's go ahead and bring our highlights a little bit darker. Maybe bring our shadows a little bit lighter. There we go. We've got a little bit more even tone there. We're gonna bring our vibrance up just a little bit. There we go. And we're gonna leave saturation where it is. All right, so this is our basic panel here. Now, this is adjusting our color as well as exposure. If you're used to working in Lightroom, it's pretty much the exact same thing that's in Lightroom. All right, let's jump into some of our other sliders and other tools that are gonna help make the image even better. Next, we're looking at our tone curve. Here we can grab our highlights, we can grab our lights. There we go. You can play with your darks and your shadows. And these are just grabbing different areas. Basically, we're working with curves, so what you would normally know as curves. Now, keep in mind, we are editing this in 16-bit, so it's gonna be a lot finer detail than editing in 8-bit. All right, next we have our detail. You can choose to sharpen, which I would always recommend doing in 16-bit if you can. Next we have our colors. I can take my reds and change the values here. We can pull these back in hue, bring more towards red. You know what? And we actually are. We're gonna bring our reds a little bit further towards orange because we did have some kind of like red areas in our skin. All right, next we have split toning. If you wanted to bring some color into your highlights and shadows, like give this a little bit more, let's say you wanted to do like a duo tone, like some warm highlights, and you wanted to pull in like cool shadows to give it something like that, this is where you can do that. And again, this is all up to you. At this point, this is a lot more like adding style to your image. So we're gonna put all those to 0 for right now. All right, next we have our lens correction. I'm gonna click on Enable Lens Profile Correction, which is going to take care of vignetting and distortion. You can see around the corners it gets pretty dark as well as distorted. So we're gonna click right there and it's going to fix that for us. All right, we have effects like dehaze. If you have an image that's super hazy, you can either add haze or take away haze. This is something they actually added pretty recently. All right, you can add grain as well. For now, we're gonna stick with the basics on this sort of thing. Okay, now you can also do camera calibration in here. Let's say you have a camera that you're shooting and it always comes out a little bit red. You can actually adjust these settings. Like you can say your red primary, you know what? It always comes out a little bit too red. You can adjust this down. There we go. And then you can go ahead and save this out. You can go to Save Settings. And then when you want to bring a new image in, you can save it with your new setting in Camera Raw. All right, guys, so that handles the basic adjustments in Camera Raw. Now I'm going to show you how we can export a couple different versions of our image and then combine those together in Photoshop. So we're looking at our image here. This is actually what it's going to be exported out. We're going to see Adobe RGB 1998. That's our color space. It's going to be exported as an 8-bit. So as soon as I hit Open Image here, it's going to export that out. And now we're not going to be working in 16-bit. We're going to be working in 8-bit. We're going to see here's our size and our 22 megapixels at 300 ppi, like points per inch. Okay, now one thing I'm going to do, because I actually want to do a couple different versions of this image, right? Our sky is still pretty blown out here. So I'm going to hold the Alt or the Option key here, and I'm going to click on Open a Copy. So we're going to click on here, Open Copy, and it's going to give us one version of this image, which looks exactly like we just had it in Camera Raw. So we can see it's RGB 8, which means now we're editing in 8-bit. Okay, so let's say we wanted to bring some information back from the sky. That's something you really want to do in 16-bit because again, we have so much more information in 16-bit. But I like her face, like her skin and everything like that. The exposure there works really well. So let's try opening up another version of this image, bringing the exposure down so we can get more detail from the sky, and then we can mask this in. So let's hit Command O. We're gonna open up the same raw image here. Now the raw image itself doesn't actually ever get affected here. The raw image, there we go. We're gonna shoot on our daylight setting there. The raw image itself doesn't get changed. We're opening copies of this raw image. So we can always go in here and change all these settings, and we can always change them back. It's non-destructive. All right, let's see if we can pull some information from our sky. So our lens correction, we're gonna turn that back on. I'm gonna bring my exposure down by quite a bit now, all right? And we're gonna bring our vibrance up, and then I'm gonna bring my temperature down as well to make it a little bit cooler. I could bring my temperature up, making it a warmer sky, or down, making it a little bit cooler. All right, that looks pretty good. So we have a nice blue sky in there and a lot more information than what we started with. So I'm gonna hit Alt or Option, and we're gonna hit Open Copy. And now we'll get another version of this. There we go, with our sky. All right, now I'm gonna do one more version where our ground is just a little bit darker. We're gonna get a nice dark dramatic image out of this. So let's hit Command O. We're gonna open the same exact raw file over again. Now again, you don't have to do all this entire process, guys. I'm just showing you guys like Oh, cool. You can use a raw converter to open multiple versions of the same image. All right. Now this time I'm going to focus on our ground a little bit. I'm going to bring my exposure down, but our shadows up a little bit and our contrast down. There we go. And we'll make that a little bit warmer. This is going to be just adding a little bit darker area on here, so we're going to be able to focus on the face of our subject. So let's hit open there. All right. So now we have 3 different versions of our image, and we're ready to combine them together. And combining them together is going to allow me to choose different parts of the image to feature. We can make our sky in focus and have some exposure in there, and our ground, something that you normally wouldn't be able to do with just one exposure. All right, guys, so now we have 3 different exposures of the same image in Photoshop. Let's go ahead and blend these together so we can get information from the sky as well as the ground and create a really dramatic image. All right, so this exposure we can see it works really well for the sky, but our subject is way underexposed. So what I want to do is I'm going to hold Alt or Option and click on my layer mask, which is going to make a black layer mask. Then we're going to grab our gradient tool here, and we're going to paint from white to transparent. That's going to be a foreground to transparent. There we go. And I'm going to click and drag from the top down, which is going to allow me to get that nice sky detail into my image. A lot of information that I would not have been able to do if I wasn't using Adobe Camera Raw. All right. Now, here on my layer mask, if I want to just paint out some of the area of my shoulder, I'll just grab my brush tool, and we'll just start painting black right over top of the skin of our subject. You can do this just with a brush tool like this. Just make sure you're using a soft edge so it blends together really nicely. There we go. Or if you feel more comfortable using selection tools, you can totally do that as well. I'm just using a brush tool because it's quick and easy. All right, and I'm just going right to the very edge. All right, and then sometimes it's not going to be perfect, so I'll take a black brush and just do a really large black brush and then just kind of like paint it very slightly over areas like this. It's just going to allow a nice even fade. There we go, and help things look a little bit more realistic. Cool, so we brought all that information from our sky. Let's go ahead and make sure it's not visible over her face too. All right, that is so cool. All right, so bringing that information in, now let's go ahead and click this layer on. I'm gonna hold Alt or Option, click on our layer mask, and then we're gonna paint white on this area too. Now you can see this area is really bright, and because I'm using a completely different exposure of this image, it's actually getting the information from the sand. It's not taking just, you know, the bright areas and darkening it down. It's actually using the light pixels from our image to make it a little bit darker, like it was actually taken, like the actual exposure was a darker exposure, which is very, very cool. All right, and I'm gonna paint this in on pretty much all areas except for, I'm gonna try to leave it from her face a little bit more, and that's gonna help draw a little more attention to our subject's face. There we go. All right, let's take a look at that just before and the after. Just helps bring a little bit more focus to our subject. All right, guys, we're looking really good. We've got 3 different images that we're combining together. Now, there's just one little thing. The darks are still super dark on the dress. So I'm gonna see if I can bring those up in a different version. So let's try that. We're gonna hit Command O. We're gonna, again, just open the same image here. There we go. Now here in Camera Raw, I'm gonna bring my exposure up, and we're gonna see we have a lot more information here on the dress. Let's bring our contrast up as well. All right, so exposure and our contrast up. And again, this time I'm just looking at the dress. So I'm gonna hold Alt or Option. We're gonna hit Open a Copy. There we go. And let's just move this with our Move tool to hit Shift, click, and drag from one image to another. All right, now what we're gonna do is I'm gonna go to Select and down to Color Range. We're gonna select out these darks here. So I'm gonna use my eyedropper and click on our darks to actually select that as my color range. We'll bring up our fuzziness a little bit. There we go, hit OK. And then we can click on our layer mask tool, and that's gonna make this just visible where our layer mask is visible. All right, now it's a little bit like in the hair and under the fingernail, so I'm gonna paint black over there because we don't necessarily need this layer to be visible in those areas. All right, but we do have a lot more detail in the dress. We can turn this off and on and see, oh yeah, there actually was some detail. And we can change our opacity here too. All right, guys, this is so cool. Let's go ahead and look at what this looks like. Here's our original image. We brought some information into the sky, some darkness into the sand, and information back into the dress. All right, let's take a look at the before and the after. Here's our before and the after. All right, guys, now I know we covered a lot in today's episode, but the basic idea is that you can open your raw images in Photoshop. From there, you can adjust things like exposure, color, even lens correction. And if you want to open multiple versions of your image in Photoshop, it's really easy. Just hold Alt or Option and click on that Open Copy. That way you can get an image that's perfect for just the sky, or just the dress, or maybe a little bit darker sand, and you can combine those together to get a beautiful image that contains information from different areas, all the way from the lightest lights to the darkest darks in Photoshop. All right, guys, and that's it for today's episode. If you love Photoshop like I do, just click on your screen right now. There's a big subscribe button there. We'll send you free Photoshop and photography episodes every single week. And if you have an idea for a new episode or a comment or question about today's episode, I'd love to hear it. Just leave it in a comment right down below. Thanks so much, guys. I'll Phlearn you later. Bye, everyone. Today. It's a beautiful today, like a JPEG or whatever, which is going to be an 8-bit format. A little confusing, so I'll just do it again. Today is the greatest today of my life. You're going to love Phlearn. Love. Cool image. If you love Photoshop like I do, why don't you go ahead and just, I didn't have anything to say. Well, that was quite the introduction. Let's go ahead and get into the episode.